Greetings and salutations yet again, APUSH students, and welcome to my online lecture on progressives, Wilson, and World War I. And if ever there was a lecture that I gave where I had to tell a story to tell another story to tell another story to tell another story, this is it. So buckle yourselves in as we kind of march through the period in U.S. history in which American citizens got very active and engaged with working to improve their government for the better, all the way up through the First World War, which is going to offer the United States an opportunity at being very transformative, both for the world and itself, and we will see whether or not the USA will take that bait. Let us continue. All right, so you guys, as you know, you're researching progressives, you learned about them. Let's cap it a little bit with this definition. In politics, to progress something is to reform it. To reform it for the better, more or less, to change it. Who tended to be progressives? Well, mostly the middle class. They tended to be mostly college-educated scholars. These were educated people who came from lots of different walks of life. They came from different cultural groups in the United States, black, white, recently immigrant, long time established in the country. They came from wealth and power. They came from very little wealth and power, but they were all over the country. And these people were improvement focused. And they tended to suspect anybody who said we shouldn't change the way the government's run because it's tradition, and tradition is sacrosanct. They did not necessarily like traditions. They felt traditions kept the United States mired in a more primitive past, and they wanted to guide the U.S. to a better tomorrow. These people themselves, in many cases, were experts in their own field, and if they weren't, they certainly worked with a lot of people who were. They also looked at the idea of efficiency as being a good thing, whether it was efficiency in government or even efficiency in business. For that reason, you can look at Henry Ford, who kind of revolutionized the production of the automobile by creating the moving assembly line to rapidly and cheaply produce mass quantities of them as sort of a progressive himself. He progressed the realm of automobile manufacturing. And their mission was really to improve life for everyone. They wanted to see everybody's life get better. And they believed that progress was always possible and that progress was always good. And in the right here, you see this political cartoon. These gigantic titanic figures such as J.P. Morgan here and Jay Gould leaning over the top of that building represent the threats to progressivism, the powerful established business and banking institutions which didn't want to see anything regarding how the government regulated, especially the economy, change. And here is the little progressive warrior, public service right down there, armed with his great big sword to take on the evil giants who stand in the way of progress for the American people. Here you have an example of the cynicism at the time. This cartoon appeared in Puck magazine in 1890, and it was kind of expressing the public's sense of cynicism towards the way politics worked, as it's depicting how you get elected into the U.S. Senate. Just drop $1 million into the pocket of your governor, or with the right bribes into the state legislature, and you can be appointed a U.S. senator. You see, it wasn't until 1917 that we actually voted for our senators. All the way from the country's founding up until 1917, states had the power to decide for themselves how their senators would be chosen. Some cases, they were appointed by the governor, and in other cases, the legislators in states chose who the senator was. But in either case, very rarely did you have a senator chosen to represent his state in Washington, D.C., who actually represented the will of the people in any sense in that state. So who does this remind us of? If you've been watching my other presentations and reading in order, this group of progressives should remind you a little bit of people known as the populists. So just to recap and compare, the populists tended to operate in the more rural, farm-laden parts of the country, whereas the progressives, you're going to tend to find them in the urban areas around the United States. Populists tended to be largely poor farmers. Progressives tended to largely be middle class. These were people who either had a good, steady job that afforded them a fairly comfortable lifestyle, or their families had the money to afford that. Populists framed arguments in the radical ideas of the day. They were using were very contemporary ideas concerning socialism and communism back then to lobby for the change they wanted and make the arguments they wanted. Meanwhile, the progressives tended to be a little bit more conservative. As opposed to imposing wide sweeping changes across the board in the country, they were interested in introducing step-by-step changes, changing little pieces of the American system without necessarily doing away with it altogether. We know that the populists largely failed in 1896 when they merged with the Democrats, and in that election, when they ran William Jennings Bryan as their champion, they lost to William McKinley in 1896, and that largely saw the end of the organized farmers movement. The progressives, however, tended to be far more successful. So maybe there's a lesson in that. If your goal is to create wide sweeping change, maybe approach solving your goal by tiny little steps at a time, like the progressives. What made them more successful compared to the populists, who did get the Sherman Antitrust Act passed into law, which is going to give government a great deal of power to break up unscrupulous business organizations? Well, the progressives changed the Constitution 4 times with the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment. They passed the Federal Income Tax Amendment with the 16th Amendment in 1913. In 1913 as well, they passed the 17th Amendment, which gave citizens the power to elect their senators directly. So they expanded democracy by giving us more control over people in our government. The 18th Amendment, that was the Prohibition Amendment, was passed in 1918, and that gave Congress the power to regulate and make illegal the transportation, distribution, sale, or production of alcohol. And of course, without a doubt, the most important amendment of the bunch, the 19th Amendment, which granted women full citizenship status and the right to vote. The populists also got the Interstate Commerce Commission created, which gave the federal government through Congress the power to regulate businesses that cross state lines. For the progressives, they saw numerous federal laws and child and consumer protection agencies formed. It would take way too long to list all of the laws that they got passed, from building codes, the creation of building codes and standards to ensure that buildings were produced and built in a safe manner, to eventually ending child labor and eventually getting minimum wage passed, to workers' rights and protections on the job. That's just a small handful of some of the laws that progressives got through. So progressives were a lot more successful than their predecessors, and maybe that's because the progressives watched how the populists floundered and learned from their mistakes. So what were the strengths that the progressives had going into their campaigns? Well, first of all, they were educated. That means these people were capable of making very well-stated, evidence-based arguments for change. These people knew how to argue and debate. More importantly, they knew how to win those arguments and debates. They were also in the middle class, and so they were kind of in a unique position where they could speak out and criticize the wealthiest among America's business owners and not sound hypocritical. And they could also stand as champions for the poor, who themselves aspired to one day be members of the middle class. They were kind of that ideal crossroads for Americans. And so they could claim that they represented the average American, right? Another advantage they had is that they were largely white, and that meant they spoke to and for a majority of the people who look like them in the country. And while that is a touch racist, it's important to note that at that point in time, if you wanted to get something through the government, you were going to have to appeal to an awful lot of white people to do it. And the fact that most progressives were white certainly aided them in that quest. And furthermore, they had religious faith. Many progressives were inspired by something we learned a while ago called the Second Great Awakening, and what came after it, the social gospel, that religiously inspired movement to make the world a better place so God likes it more, to clean up the sin on earth. And so from their abolitionist ancestors, that's where they draw their roots. And their religious faith is the faith that's shared by most Americans, 90% of Americans at this time. It's rooted in Protestant Christianity. And it also, as a result, kind of gave their work a sense of a higher calling. They could sort of stamp their work as quote unquote approved by God, if that makes sense. So let's take a look at another way to define progressivism. Think of progressivism as a great big umbrella, and in so doing, we're also going to see some of its weaknesses, right? So who were progressives? Well, they were muckrakers. They were those investigative journalists who like to dig up the dirty little secrets in politics or the dirty little secrets in industry and expose the muck, expose the filth before the American people and the press. Upton Sinclair is perhaps the most famous of all muckrakers, who exposed the horrible working conditions and cleanliness of our meatpacking plants at the time. You had the suffragettes, men and women alike, who were fighting to get women full citizenship and the right to vote. You had the populists, who we've learned about earlier. They were certainly progressive. You also had people who were lobbying for safe food and drugs, trying to literally clean up the what was becoming the beginnings of our medical system in this country, as well as its food production, as more and more people are buying more and more mass-produced food, thanks to the Civil War era innovation of canning food, of putting food in tins and preserving it. You also had people who were fighting to end child labor. You had people who were fighting to improve education and people's access to education, who were saying that children don't belong in the factories, they belong in the classroom. You had this interesting group of people called the Goo-Goos, which was a nickname for people who believed in good government. These were politicians and their followers who believed that it's the problem of corrupt politicians who get in office that make government flounder. That you can elect good politicians, you can get good people into government to do good work. And so you have the Goo-Goos. You also have the prohibitionists, the people fighting to end the consumption of alcohol in America. Alcohol at this time was responsible for something like 60% of all crimes. And if it wasn't responsible, it was least involved in 60% of all violent crimes at this time. So everything from murders to spousal abuse, child abuse, fights. Alcohol was tied into a lot of that. And so a lot of people thought, well, if you get rid of the alcohol, maybe you get rid of a lot of the problems. It's progress, right? You had labor unions, people who were fighting to expand the protections and rights for working people. You also had civil rights activists. As soon as Reconstruction ended in 1876, African Americans experienced the full weight of white racism in the South as that bore down on them in the form of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow laws, or black codes, were passed left and right to not only separate African Americans from white Southerners in all walks of life, but to ensure that African Americans would forever enjoy only a second-class status. So as soon as Reconstruction ended, you had people pop up like Booker T. Washington who tried to progress the cause of improving conditions in the country for African Americans. And then you have your income distribution advocates. These are your old socialists who are taking a look at how the wealthy few could buy and sell the rest of the country left and right with their masses of accrued wealth, while countless millions toiled to barely be able to survive every day. So let me go back to that really quick. That is kind of a hodgepodge definition of all the different groups who could call themselves progressives, but it's also one of the weaknesses of the progressives as well. And if you take a look at that list, you see a whole lot of different groups that don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other. And so therefore you have a problem where there's too many chefs in the kitchen, too many cooks working on dinner. And so it was perfectly rational, for example, to be a civil rights advocate, yet not believe in income redistribution. It was perfectly fine to be a suffragette and to believe that women should get the vote, but to maybe not care a whole lot about the Prohibition Party, right? So not only did some of these groups not have anything to do with each other, they in some way, shapes, and forms also combated and conflicted with one another. So progressivism was this huge umbrella, and underneath there was a lot of complexity. So what were some other weaknesses of the progressives? Like I talked about, they had numerous diverse interests. And when you combine that with the fact that sometimes their interests conflicted, that means you had a group of people who could not group all of their interests under one political party. It would be impossible to group every progressive issue in one political party. And that's a problem because it's politics that gets you elected to office, and it's political parties that get things done or don't get things done. And so if you can't organize your group very well, it's going to be hard to accomplish things politically. And all of these groups felt that their issue, whatever it was the most important issue that America had to tackle. And if we take care of my issue first, then every other issue is going to solve itself, right? And so there was a tremendous amount of competition for attention and a tremendous call out for action on different competing, conflicting issues. You also had the fact that ego was part of it. Very few people were willing to play second fiddle to others. And what I mean by that is if you are a progressive advocating for the women's right to vote, you did not want to divert your time and interest to help another group first. You wanted your issue accomplished first. You don't necessarily want to help somebody out and make them first, right? Also, there was an issue of how to reach out to African Americans, and many embraced disenfranchised Americans, which was kind of the point, reaching out to blacks who were facing very unfair, certainly unconstitutional segregation in the South, as well as women. But the problem is blacks did not have, especially Southern blacks, they didn't have much of a voice nationally. And women certainly didn't either. And so if you're reaching out to groups who don't really control much of the vote, you may be popular with those groups, but you're not necessarily going to win a lot of elections. And you got to remember, the time all this is going on is right in the middle of the Gilded Age, when corruption in the government at all levels, from cities all the way up to the national government, was rife. It was fierce, and it was very resistant to change. So what did the progressives have for help? Well, sadly, the biggest aid to them came in the form of both natural and man-made disasters, like the Chicago fire of 1871, which over the period of 3 days burned roughly 2/3 of the city, if not more. As rumor has it, it was supposedly a cow. You see the slaughterhouses in the back. It was supposedly a cow that started it when a woman was allegedly bringing her milk cows into the barn at night. She set her lantern down. One of the cows allegedly kicked it over, and the flames caught on the barn, and it spread from there. There isn't 100% corroboration on that, but that's kind of the story that has survived to this day. The Chicago fire definitely convinced people of the importance of having things like a publicly paid fire squad, right, to go out and handle those fires and put money into their department so that they can get all the tools they need to prevent that sort of thing from happening. It also kind of sparked the interest of creating laws to determine how buildings can be built. How far apart or how closely can you build big buildings? What sort of materials can you use? And the push to make buildings more and more fire resistant became more and more loud as time went on. The Johnstown flood was the largest man-made disaster in American history, at least until 9/11. Roughly 2,000 Americans died when, and mostly in the city of Johnstown, when a neighboring river that was dammed up, when the dam broke and just unleashed billions of gallons of water going very, very fast and destroying everything, as you can see, in its path. More than 2,000 people died. And the dam broke because there was very little attention paid to its quality or safety. It was a shoddy job that, a company cut a lot of corners. They got paid by the state to build the dam. They put a lot of that money in their pocket and cut every corner possible to make the cheapest dam they could. And as a result, thousands of deaths. You have the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. The earthquake only lasted for a minute and a half, but the fires in some parts burned for nearly a week. And again, this brought attention to the idea of safety standards for buildings and building things like fire escapes and improving the quality of roads, because one of the problems they had with the earthquake was all the collapsed buildings blocked rescue efforts to get inside the city to save people. Most notorious among these is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This is the 5th floor of a building in New York City, which was a shirtwaist manufacturer. And what shirtwaists were back then, that's what they called blouses. It used to be that the top of the dress and the bottom of the dress, they were all sold as one thing until people in the clothing industry realized, hey, we can make more money by selling them separate, and that way women can kind of, mix and match, so to speak. And so shirt waists became eventually what we know today as the blouse, and this was a factory where they were made. And in this particular factory, the owners would lock the doors to the factory from the outside to keep their workers from punching in, sneaking out and playing hooky, and then coming back in at the end of their shift and punching back out without having done any work, even though there wasn't really any evidence that that was happening very often. Well, what happened is you've got this whole floor which is working with textiles, so as a result you have dust, all the little cotton trills and dust flying all over the place. It's a very dry room, and as you can see from the windows, the sun angles in quite sharply, and that's exactly what happened. The sun was focused by one of the windows into kind of like a beam like you do with the magnifying glass, and a pile of scraps caught fire, and the fire spread very, very quickly. Nobody was able to get out because the doors were locked. In fact, after the fire was put out, dozens of bodies were found next to each exit, and it was widely believed that many of those people died because they were crushed to death because they couldn't get out. There were no fire escapes, and so people who didn't want to take their chances on the exit took their chances with gravity and jumped out. Every single one of them died. There were quotes in newspapers at the time from horrified onlookers talking about this rain of human bodies and the impact and the sound of the impact when they hit the ground. And in total, more than 140 people died in this fire, including child labor, including some kids, I believe as young as 12, 13 years old. When the owners of the factory were taken to court and charged with everything from manslaughter to wanton disregard for human life, they faced a total fine of $100 because, as it turned out, all of their practices, not having any safety equipment, not having any equipment to put out a fire, locking their doors from the outside, no fire escapes, they weren't breaking any laws with that. And so because of these accidents, the cry to start regulating the safety of cities and regulating the safety of factories became louder and louder. Technology was also going to be a big hand to the progressives because we're in the age of photography, right? And cameras can convey more information and more emotion sometimes than an entire well-written essay. And of course, we have mass printing as well. So as soon as you can take a picture, develop it, and get it to a newspaper, it can be in the hands of tens of thousands of people the very next day. So quick, efficient way to effectively communicate. You also have the telephone and related technology like the telegraph. So you can, again, communicate over great distances very quickly as well. So problems in New York could be known to the rest of the world literally overnight. Word travels fast at this time. You also have the development of Mr. Litchfield's favorite thing in the world, statistical science. And you have more and more people collecting statistical data on everything from injuries in the workplace to the average salary paid to the average unskilled worker to kind of drive their point home using statistics and math that there were some serious problems that needed attention in our society. So the progressives, what makes them so important is kind of like the same thing that made the populists so important. They found a political ally. But unlike the populists who weren't able to get their ally in office, the progressives' political ally was already there, and his name was Teddy Roosevelt. Youngest president we've ever had in the United States, 42 years old. When he took office, he created a legislative package known as the Square Deal. Just for future reference, that of course is going to be heard when we get to FDR and the Great Depression, who creates the New Deal, and President Truman, who creates the Fair Deal, right? They're all kind of hearkening back to Teddy Roosevelt's first efforts to bring progressive action to the presidency. And Roosevelt believed in a United States that could be and should be fair for everyone, hence the nickname Square Deal, meaning fair. And in 1903, some of the progressive stuff he took action on was a massive coal strike that was literally shutting down the nation, with tens of thousands of workers picketing several different coal industries over things like pay, work hours, and safety. Teddy Roosevelt was the very first president to interfere in a labor strike. And he did, and he dragged both sides to the table and made the coal mining owners accept a fairly significant per hour raise for the strikers. and won them some big concessions from that. And so Teddy Roosevelt made a very good friend with the working man that day in 1903 when he took their side in that strike. No small thanks to Upton Sinclair, who brought to the attention of the country just how horrible the meatpacking conditions were, how horribly their sausage and their bacon and their potted meat and stuff was produced. Once that came to light, once the jungle was passed in 1906, it's like you never saw Congress act so fast. They passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which set up a department in the U.S. government to inspect places where food was produced and inspect the quality of medicine to begin ensuring that not only is this stuff safe, but in the case of drugs, that it's going to do what it's advertising, right? So that became a big deal. Teddy Roosevelt put his weight behind that law. He was also known as a trust buster. He resurrected the law that the populace got passed in the 1870s, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and found new life for it. Because what was ironic about the Sherman Antitrust Law is that it was initially used to break up unions. It said that organizations, business organizations or whatever that get in the way of business in America cannot be allowed. And so instead of going after monopolies and going after trusts, Congress used it to go after labor unions. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was the first guy to start breaking up monopolies and these trusts, which are not quite monopolies. They're groups of people in the same business. So like all the sugar producers get together and they set all of the prices themselves and they agree not to compete so that they can make higher and higher wages. Teddy Roosevelt's really the first president to go after them, and he's got the nickname of Trust Buster because he was breaking up those business combinations. He also strengthened the other big populist win, the Interstate Commerce Commission, made it tougher on railroads, made it tougher on interstate business. And the Elkins and Hepburn Acts were two laws that got passed that helped him do just that. You also see Teddy Roosevelt put his might behind a new progressive issue in America, something that had only been taken up by a handful of people like John Muir, for instance, and that's the issue of conservation. And I'll get to that in a second. Teddy Roosevelt also did another landmark thing. He was the first president to invite and dine with an African American in the White House ever. Here you see a picture of him seated on one side of the table dining with Booker T. Washington, who at the time was largely the most famous African American for his creation of the Tuskegee Institute, one of the first colleges to train adult black professionals. And Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to dine with him. And of course, you see right between him Abraham Lincoln's portrait there. That's no accident. And so Teddy Roosevelt is doing a lot of things as president to push for progress in this country. And it's interesting to note that Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. So when we look at the years 1901 to 1908, you could make the argument that Republicans, or at least some of the Republicans in the party, had very progressive interests in mind. Back to the conservation issue. We'll get to that, in 1 second. But for those 7 years he was in office, remember, he took office after William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. It seemed like he was steering the Republican Party in the progressive direction. We're going to learn that that's not necessarily the case soon enough. But it's kind of an interesting point where the Republican Party, who was initially very progressive in terms of ending slavery and granting full citizenship rights to former slaves, who then abandoned that in favor of promoting U.S. business. It seems like in 1901, the Republican Party, who's still only about 45 years old, has an opportunity to evolve and change once again. And we'll look and see what that happens, or what happens with that soon. But I got this great picture, a view we should all recognize. That's Bridal Veil Falls at Yosemite, and that's Teddy Roosevelt posing for the picture there with John Muir. Teddy Roosevelt was probably the biggest outdoor lover of all of our U.S. presidents. He loved camping. He loved hunting. His hunting skills were huge, and he went on huge safari expeditions in Africa. After he was president, he did a year-long expedition on the Amazon River in South America, and he loved traveling all over the American wilderness. Before he was president for a time, he worked as a cattle rancher in, I believe it was North or South Dakota. So he loved being outside, and he associated America's beauty with its strength. And so he put the power of the national government behind places like Yosemite Valley and protected those areas from being exploited by private business, saying that we're going to keep these areas remaining in their natural, pristine beauty for as long as we possibly can. We will not exploit them for profit, because part of what makes America great is its beautiful land. So let's get to not the election in 1908, but the election in 1912. I had to tell you all that about Teddy Roosevelt so I could set up this drama right here, the dramatic election of 1912. Now, let's set the stage. Between the years 1860 and 1912, for those 52 years, Democrats held the White House a total of 2 times by only one person. That was Grover Cleveland, who was, if you remember, that one president who served the 2 separate terms from 1884 to 1888 and 1892 to 1896. So 52 years, Democrats had only 8 of those years. Republicans had the other 44. The Democrats are really, really, really aching for a victory. And as a result of Republican leadership dominating the nation, we see Republicanism very popular in the North and the West, but it's not very popular in the South by 1912. Now, again, Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was built around progressive ideals in many ways. The passage of the Clean Food and Drug Act, the government as the arbiter in labor disputes, the government coming in when labor and management can't settle their disagreements, the government will come in and help both groups find parity. He put the government in control over railroads and railroad lines. He set the government on a path to bust up these super wealthy and powerful monopolies like Chevron and Standard Oil. Pardon me, not Chevron. Chevron came out of that and gained the nickname of a trust buster as a result. He set the government up as a conservation manager, protecting our wilderness. And in 1908, he was ready to step aside after his 2 terms and hand things over to his vice president, William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft won easily. He won in a landslide in 1908. But as Taft's presidency goes forward, Teddy Roosevelt becomes increasingly disappointed with his former best buddy Taft, as well as the Republican Party. Part of that is no doubt because of how Taft is going to turn the Republicans back towards focusing on industry and the economy and away from progressivism. But part of it is, you got to remember, Roosevelt was a young guy. He got out of the presidency. He wasn't even 50 years old when he left the presidency. So maybe some of his frustration came from a bias of like, well, I did a better job when I was president. If I was president, I would have done this differently. And maybe he's hungry to get back in to that position. All right. So this is going to lead to some interesting decisions from the Republican Party. And what that decision is going to be is the Republican Party is going to divide. It's going to split against itself. A bitter Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, after the last couple of years of campaigning against his vice president and complaining about what a miserable national leader he turned out to be, in the 1912 election, Teddy Roosevelt's going to throw his hat in the ring to run for the presidency of the Republican Party. So Teddy Roosevelt is competing to run for a 3rd term against his former vice president and current president, William Howard Taft. And in 1912, the Republican convention decides to go with Taft. They choose to go with focusing on business. Teddy Roosevelt is insanely bitter about this, and he storms out of that convention in Chicago in 1912, and all of his followers follow him on out. And he vows to run a campaign and win the presidency in 1912, if for no other reason than to spite the Republican Party. This is how the Bull Moose Party was born. And the Bull Moose Party called for some very progressive reforms, among them the ability for Americans to directly elect their senators. Remember, they couldn't do that before. The Bull Moose Party wanted to reduce tariffs, something that would benefit and bring down costs for the average American consumer. They wanted to see mandatory presidential primaries. In other words, the system we have now in which people who want to be president, they campaign state after state after state, and people in each state vote for all the Democratic or all the Republican candidates who are running, who do they like the most. And it's the primaries who tend to choose who that candidate for the presidency is going to be. The Bull Moose Party, Teddy Roosevelt, wanted to see that become the way of the land. Instead of just high-ranking officials in the party choosing who your candidate is going to be, put the power of choosing the presidential candidates in the hands of the people. Expand democracy. He wanted to end child labor, and he took a very progressive stance on women's suffrage. He lobbied hard to see that women get the right to vote. And as it turns out, the Bull Moose Party had a platform that looked a lot like this party's. Here you see a picture of Eugene Victor Debs on the left, who ran in 1912 as the Socialist Party candidate for president. And it frustrated the socialists. They're looking at Teddy Roosevelt's party form, and they're seeing all of the ideas that they had being kind of stolen by him, co-opted by him as he runs. And he's a much more popular national figure than anybody in the Socialist Party. But it's also worth noting that the socialists then look very different than the socialists today. It's also worth noting that the Democrats, as seen here depicted by Woodrow Wilson, who was renowned with cleaning up politics in New Jersey, both as governor there as well as his time as a reformer in Princeton University, which he ran for a number of years and improved as well. So Wilson was kind of running a campaign that was based on reform. So now this is what's funky about the 1912 election. You got not one, not two, not three parties that are running on reforms that look very similar to each other against the Republican Party, who's sticking with Taft and sticking with those old school Republican values. Put business first. So here you see a political cartoon kind of depicting what happened in 1912 at that Republican convention. Here you see half the party bolting out and moving away, and the other half of the party saying, "I'll stand pat." That means I'm not going to move. The moving part of the party there, that is Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. The "I'll stand pat," those are the conservative Republicans under Taft. Here you see a political cartoon trying to reach out to the working man. Taft is for prosperity, so a vote for Taft is a vote for improving your own economic condition. Here you see an interesting commentary. This isn't necessarily a promotion for any political party, but a commentary as the two animals in the back, a donkey and an elephant, of course, representing the Democrat and Republican parties, say, "Suffering snakes, theater has changed." And here you see the great big bull moose with Teddy Roosevelt's face and that infamous wide grin and those tiny little glasses he'd wear on his nose that kind of made his eyes look very small, right? It's the latest arrival at the political zoo. And here you see a campaign poster for Teddy Roosevelt. The Bull Moose Party was also nicknamed the Progressive Party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party. And you see Teddy Roosevelt saying, "My hat is still in the ring." That's a very famous hat. That was the hat that he wore into battle in the Spanish-American War when he led the cavalry up the charge of San Juan Hill. A moment in that war that catapulted him to fame as really the biggest, if not the only war hero to come out of the Spanish-American War. So it's kind of like he's waving the bloody shirt there, but instead of the Civil War, it's the Spanish-American War. So you have the working class candidate who made no bones that they were reaching out to the working class. That's again Eugene Victor Debs, who was running for president, and Emil Siegel, who was running as vice president. And you see the Socialist Party, "Workers of the world unite," that phrase that has been famous or infamous ever since, depending on your point of view on communism and socialism. Let's take a quick look at some numbers here, right? You've got every 2 years, because every 2 years you elect people in the House of Representatives, so there's an election for the national level of government every 2 years, from 1888 up to 1912, and it shows you what happens. The Socialist Party isn't even a thing in the 1880s and 90s. 1900, it starts out very small, and then every year it seems to add, for the most part, except for a dip here and there, 100,000 or so followers. In 1900, they had 96,000 voters. In 1910, 607,000 voters. That combined with the fact that there was a Socialist Labor Party that already existed, so you had two socialist parties in our country, and you see the numbers they're putting up, leads to the total number of people who voted year after year. And in this election in 1912, the Socialist Party got nearly 1 million votes, at just over 900,000. Now that might not seem like much today, but back in 1912, when half the population, that is women, weren't voting, That was out of a total of about 15 million votes. So what that means is roughly 1 out of 15 Americans by 1912 was voting for socialists. And so you kind of see that there's that growing interest, that growing perception in America that maybe socialism is the right direction for this country, and they're getting more popular. So let's talk about the campaign. Here you see a political cartoon, clearly poking some fun at the Democratic Party's candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Again, you see him with his graduation cap and gown because of his time as Dean of Princeton University. He's associated with education. Kind of balking at jumping over some of these obstacles because they're a little high. Issues like free trade and foreign immigration. The black question, how does the government reach out to disenfranchised blacks across the country? The recall of judges, corrupt or incompetent judges, and the tariff itself. You see Wilson sweating that, those beads flying out of his head, because he wasn't quite clear and he wasn't quite certain himself what his stance on those issues were. Here you see another take on the Democratic Party as the Republicans themselves kind of made the tariff reform the big issue of the 1912 election. Do we keep the tariffs high and protect American businesses the way American businesses wanted them to, or do we reduce the tariffs and instead promote the interests of the working class, the people who are going shopping, and bring those prices down? Well, up to bat, you have the Democratic Party, and given how big the ball is, it's highly unlikely the Democrats are going to miss hitting this sucker. Now the question is, are they going to hit it out of the park or not? Another interesting political cartoon dealing specifically with the issue of suffrage and women voters and the issues that women valued then. For instance, pure food, right? Clean, safe food to eat. Women were responsible for their kids, and if they are buying food that is produced toxically, man, they want to make sure that gets cleaned up. They want factory inspectors to protect their husbands and children who are at work, let alone the women who are at work as well. They wanted child labor laws. They wanted clean, drinkable milk. They wanted the abolition of the white slave traffic. What that means is prostitution around the country. They wanted prostitution outlawed. They also wanted uniform laws that the whole country could follow so that states couldn't wiggle out of it. And you have some shouting for equal pay for women, right? And here you see the three big candidates. Taft with the elephant behind him as the Republican, Woodrow Wilson with the donkey Democrat behind them, and then Teddy Roosevelt with the bull moose. And what's interesting, of course, is the body language each person is extending. Taft seems a little unwilling to extend his interest to women voters, but he's kind of holding his hand and saying, well, I don't have any choice. I got to stick it out. Woodrow Wilson seems a little aloof on the issue, but he's holding his hand out nonetheless. But when you look at Teddy Roosevelt, he's pulling out the plank of his party platform that specifically said the Bull Moose Party is pro-women suffrage, and he's the one who's reaching out to women. Here's another political cartoon that's kind of having some fun with how aggressively Teddy Roosevelt pursued women for his cause. Even though they couldn't vote, he still actively pursued it. And so here you have the campaign headquarters for women's suffrage. Teddy Roosevelt dressed in drag at the time, bringing flowers for them, votes for women, kind of highlighting the fact that he was the pro-women's suffrage candidate, along with Debs in that election. And here you see the other issue that isn't going to get dealt with or not, and that's the concern for African Americans. And you see justice there, and what's happening with justice's scales. They're being tossed aside as a rope with a noose is being dangled over it, right? And the guy who's wearing that has the words mob law on his hat. And the question above, is that really all her right arm is good for? Just turning a blind eye to the plight and the suffering of African Americans who are being lynched at the rate of about 1 every 8 days at that point in time. As far as the Republican Party and how they were reaching out to blacks, this cartoon kind of hits it, right? One of the most important things the president does is he hires a lot of people, from his cabinet to filling all sorts of positions, from everything from postmasters and postal workers on up the chain. That meant he could give a lot of people a lot of work. And here you see of that big stew pot of federal offices a little sign that says white help only. And he's extending past the colored line here just a tiny little taste to black voters. Clearly, the Republican Party isn't going to do much for the black vote. Meanwhile, again, you see Teddy Roosevelt trying to go out and court the black vote himself. What you see him doing here is sprinkling salt, progressive salt, on the back of a crow's tail feathers. And the old wives' tale in those days basically said that if you sprinkle salt on a bird's tail, the bird will come to you, it will follow you. It's like you're enchanting them, right? Now, there's a reason the artist used the crow, right? The crows are black. It's the black vote. Teddy Roosevelt is trying to pull in that black vote with his progressive salt, right? So he's campaigning a little bit more aggressively for African American voters. Now, let's do the political math. If you have the Republican Party and divide it by the Bull Moose Party, what are you going to get? You're going to get the Democratic Party. That's how that equation works. The ballot for 1912, here's a picture of how that looked. You had the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, the Republican candidate William Howard Taft, the Socialist candidate Eugene Debs. You had the Prohibition Party, a party solely formed on the single issue of getting rid of alcohol, who was running a candidate for president. You had the Bull Moose Party with Teddy Roosevelt, and then you had the Socialist Labor ticket. So again, two different socialist parties there in 1912 with 6 candidates for president. Quite a funky choice. So what were the results of this election? Well, here's the map. And again, in this case, the Democrats are framed by the red color, the Progressive, that is the Bull Moose Party, by green, and the Republicans in the blue. And it looks like the Democrats just cleaned house. However, you got to remember that the Republicans were being split. So in a state where 30% of that population votes for Teddy Roosevelt and 30% of that population votes for William Howard Taft, when 40% of that state, a minority of people in the state, vote for Woodrow Wilson, it's going to make him look like the big winner, and it's going to make it easier for him to capture all these states. See, when you look at the popular vote count, you see that the Democrats only got 42% of the country's votes. The Bull Moose Party got 27%, and the Republican Party got about 23%. So if the party didn't split, the Republicans would have had 50% of the vote easily and would have won yet another term in office. But because that party split in half, that allowed the Democrats to sneak on in and take this election away from them. The Republicans kind of not learning from the past and not learning from what happened to the Democrats in that 1896 election that saw populists and Democrats divided over voting for William Jennings Bryan. So the 1912 election marked the zenith. This was the highest point, the most popular the Socialist Party ever became in America. They had nearly 1 million votes out of those 15 million that were counted. Never again would the Socialist Party have that kind of popularity in the country. And what's kind of funky about this, too, is if you're a Democrat, you're thinking, hey, yay, we won, but we only won with 42% of the vote. In 1916, are we going to count on the Republicans to split again? No. So we've got to be ready for that. And what's, again, kind of gnarly about this is compared to 1908, the Democrats won fewer votes in 1912 than they won in 1908. They lost 100,000 votes in those 4 years, but because the Republicans split, they still captured the election. So what does that mean for the Democrats? Well, 3 of 4 parties promised Americans major political reforms. The Democrats were elected with a minority of the votes, a large minority, but a minority nonetheless. So what does Wilson have to do? He has to embrace certain elements of progressivism, or they're going to get crushed in the 1916 election. They will lose. And so as a result, like I mentioned earlier, you see 4 amendments added to the Constitution under Wilson's presidency. The 16th Amendment, which created the graduated income tax, which basically means the way the graduated income tax initially worked was the more money you made, the more tax you paid. It doesn't work that way anymore because laws have since changed, but that's how it started out. The 17th Amendment has put the power to vote-in senators directly in the hands of the people. The 18th Amendment, as we know, created prohibition, and the 19th Amendment, that's what gave women the right to vote across the country 100 years ago. Now, he also passed a lot of legislation to help working class people, things to limit the maximum number of hours that one could work a day, as well as to end child labor. Congress wrote these laws, he passed them, but the Supreme Court of the United States, that's what SCOTUS stands for, the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional, saying that the President and Congress don't have the authority in the Constitution to tell states how they can manage and regulate their business. So Wilson tried to get that happening, but unfortunately for advocates of child labor and improving conditions for workers in factories, they're going to have to wait another couple of decades to see those laws make it through. So what about troubled international waters? Wilson, when he's elected, it's almost clear right away that he takes office in 1913. The very next year, in August of that year, the world's going to be at war. Well, he decides to declare neutrality. He is going to keep the U.S. out of this war. And that was kind of the popular mood at the time. A lot of people didn't understand how England and France and Germany and Russia got sucked into this fight that was really just between Austria and Serbia. Americans did not want to get dragged into fighting a European war on European soil for European issues. So Wilson promises to keep us neutral, but it's interesting. Kind of like the War of 1812, which was 100 years earlier, he's not regulating business and trade. And so you have American businesses that want to do business with Germany and that want to do business with England and want to do businesses with both. And the question is, are we really neutral when we are engaging in trade and profiting off of other people's wars? And the answer is, of course, no, we are not. So, more on that in a moment. Let's get into Wilson's real progressivism, that is his liberalism. Wilson does not in the end become a true progressive leader. Even though the 19th Amendment passed during his time in office, that had more to do with what women were doing to advocate than him. He was not a big champion, and he was not a big supporter of women getting the right to vote. But he did change things, and he did move America in a little bit of a different direction. He created this diplomatic style known as moral diplomacy, in which the United States and by encouraging other empires around the world would use morals to guide its colonialism. And the idea that, if we're going to go ahead and have colonies, we should help the colonies out at least as much as they're helping us out. We should do good things for them. We should also apologize to those territories and colonies that we have that we've abused in the past. We should make reparations to them. So he's turning our foreign policy a little bit away. And as a result of him doing that, every Democrat since Woodrow Wilson has had this softer, more progressive tone on diplomacy, that the United States should be a country that helps and aids other countries around the world, not necessarily just seeks to profit from them. He wanted to see democracy spread and wanted to see more countries embrace it. He wanted to end all tariffs, actually. He wanted to promote free trade around the world. Everybody reduce your tariffs. That'll only be good for trade around the world. And he also thought that would be good for peace, because the more countries are trading with each other, the more money they're making off of each other, the more they're interacting with each other, the more they like each other. And if that's the case, then they don't necessarily want to go to war, right? So he saw free trade as a way to end wars. He also wanted to see eventually all colonies get their independence, thus ending empires. And he was not only willing to work with international organizations to maintain peace, to build up global prosperity and to promote democracy, he helped create one of those. The League of Nations, which comes into being after World War I, was his baby. And so those 5 points, diplomacy guided by ethics and morals, spreading democracy, promoting free trade, ending tariffs, independence for colonies, and working and cooperating with countries in international organizations, that kind of became the definition for what a liberal in the 20th century, in the 1900s, was all about. Wilson created the template for liberalism that all the way up through even President Obama. Many of these ideals were things that Obama himself embraced. So Wilson's setting some pretty important patterns there. Now, as far as World War I's concerned, it's going to be an opportunity for the country. And Wilson sees World War I as an opportunity for the country as well. The question is the country going to see that opportunity, and are they going to embrace that turning point? So let's jump into World War I. right? Because this is going on when Wilson was doing all that other stuff in office and amendments were getting passed. Meanwhile, in Europe, right? So you got to remember the causes of World War I, and it's easy to remember if you remember the word Maine. No, we're not talking about the battleship that was sunk that started the Spanish-American War. We're just talking about the word Maine, M-A-I-N. The main causes of World War I were militarism, M is for militarism, alliances for A, imperialism for I, and nationalism for N. All of those ingredients existed in abundance around the world, especially Europe, as in the years approaching World War I. So when Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, of that empire, that was the action that started World War I. But if it weren't for those main ingredients, as militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, there never would have been a world war. It would have just been a small conflict between Austria and Serbia that we probably never would have even cared about. But because those four ingredients existed, you had several countries armed to the teeth and ready to flex their military might, a complex web of alliances, fierce competition for colonies throughout the world, as well as rampant nationalism, which is a little different than patriotism. All those conditions existed around the world. That's what makes this small conflict between Serbia and Austria a global issue. Let's just take a quick look deeper into what these are. Here you're seeing a demonstration of militarism, right? Massive troops of armies parading to the cheering masses as they send their sons off to go fight and die in battle, because if you're militaristic, you believe there is no more noble death than dying for your country in battle. Here you see another aspect of militarism. If you're going to have massive militaries, you're going to have massive arsenals. And this particular factory was producing bombshells. How bad do you think it would be to go to work with a raging case of allergies and sneezing on any given day of the week there, right? Another aspect, again, are the weapons of war, the technology of war. And here you see a factory that is producing the bodies, the fuselages of those early planes in the 19 teens. Here you see a woman working on what's going to be eventually the cannon, the artillery cannon itself, building a piece of artillery. And you notice a woman is doing the work. And why do we see so many women in this picture and so many women in this picture? Well, that's because all the men were called out to serve in the military. So women during World War I are stepping up by taking over their jobs in factories. Now, I don't expect you to memorize this. I'm not going to test you on the alliance system in World War I. But if you come out of anything for what the alliances was like, come out with the fact that they were just jumbled and confused. Because again, the issue at hand was between Serbia and the Austria-Hungary Empire, right? It was between them. And when World War I starts, Serbia even kind of splits off on one side, goes with Russia, France, and Britain. The other half of the country that Serbia was a part of, Bulgaria, goes with Austria, Germany, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. And so you had this very complex web, which meant once Serbia got in a fight with Austria-Hungary, Russia was going to get pulled in. And then Russia, who had alliances to France and Britain, is going to pull them in as well. And Austria, who had alliances with Italy and Germany, pulls them into this fight. Germany, who had an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, gets pulled in as well. And so this is kind of one of those things where you have that one mouthy friend who's always getting himself in trouble and always expects all of you, his other friends, to join in and help him out when he is in trouble. And that's what happens in World War I. So messed up that Italy at the time had a secret alliance with France and Britain that if Italy turned coat and joined their side in the middle of the war, they would get a better deal at the peace table at the end of the war. So that's exactly what Italy did. You had secret alliances, secret treaties. Nobody even really knew who was allied with who until the war started, and then we found out, man, it was just one big bloody mess. What about imperialism? Well, what you're looking at right here is a map of the empires around the world. And of course, the big empires were all headquartered in Europe. And you see the colors for all of those European countries except for one. And so the dark blue corresponds with the French, who had colonized most of West Africa, including Madagascar, Southeast Asia, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, among several islands off here in the Pacific. And they even had a tiny little sphere of influence in China. The British, however, had the lion's share of the empire. The Only empire on Earth that was on every continent except Antarctica, and the only country that could boast the sun never set on their empires. They had Canada and trying to remember the name of this tiny little country in South America, Belize. That's right under Mexico. They also had a couple colonies in South America, Australia, New Zealand, of course, as well as India, southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, and nearly a north to south strip of territory in Africa, as well as a couple spheres of influence in China. Now, what's interesting as well is the United States is listed as one of these empires here. Why? Because you look, after the Spanish-American War, we all but got control of Cuba and Puerto Rico and several other neighboring islands there. In 1898, we also had the rightful ruler of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, overthrown so her brother could take the throne and put the United States under its protectorship. We also had the Philippines in our empire. But what is not shown by this is the fact that even though the United States didn't colonize everything in North and South America, they virtually controlled it because of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States saw to it that their neighbors were going to do business that was going to be good for the U.S. And as far as China goes, it looks like China wasn't anybody's colony. Well, it's just the opposite. China was everybody's colony. Nearly every one of these countries, including the United States, had a little piece of China cut off so that they could have access to that massive market and trade that China provided. And the reason it isn't colonized by one person, because if one country, like say England, tried to get control of all of China, all of the other countries would have declared war on England right there. And that's what is good to note. It's that World War I happened to start with the assassination of the Archduke, but conflict over territory in China or conflict over colonies in Africa could have, and in some cases nearly did, start World War I earlier. And of course, you got a political cartoon. And England at that time was a lot like Tom Brady today. If you were a Patriots fan, you loved Tom Brady. If you were English, you loved the English Empire. But to everybody else around the world, the British Empire was this great, big, greedy monster reaching its multiple tentacles all over the world, grabbing up Egypt and Asia and Canada and New Zealand and just grabbing up all the land it possibly can, right? Nasty little monster. Here you see the United States extending its imperial might, Teddy Roosevelt here stretching across the Gulf of the Atlantic Ocean, keeping Europeans separate from the Americas to make sure, in other words, that the United States can run the Americas the way they want. Swinging in his new diplomacy, big stick diplomacy. Speak softly. In other words, ask your neighbors politely for what you want, and if they refuse to give it to you, then use your big stick. And for the United States, its big stick was its Great White Fleet, its brand new modern Navy. Let's talk about nationalism really quick. Nationalism is something that often gets confused with patriotism. To be a patriot is to somebody who wants to serve your country, whether that's serve in the military or serve in the Coast Guard or serve as a teacher, as a police officer, as a firefighter, as somebody who works in the medical industry, for instance. You want to serve the people of your country. You want to do good things to make your country better. A nationalist does not quite see it the same way. A nationalist believes their country is simply the best country on earth. Not only is our country great, but a nationalist will quickly tell you that every other country on earth sucks. And this is the attitude we see coming up, this fierce nationalism. As in this propaganda poster, the British government is trying to promote the Irish as heroes, celebrating the valor of Michael O'Leary, who defeated 10 Germans, in an effort to really just recruit Irish people into Britain's war effort. World War I was insanely unpopular with the Irish. The Irish actually wanted to join the Germans, and if they weren't a British colony, they would have, because they hated England that much. So England was trying to promote a sense of national pride in the Irish for the British interest. Here you see a German piece of propaganda equating the British with being nothing more than these massive life-stealing spiders as they extend their web all over the French peninsula, all over Europe, and into Turkey as well. And it's the falcon of Germany that's going to protect Europe from this scourge of this spider. Here you see a U.S. piece of propaganda, and its audience is very interesting here, saying, remember, the flag of liberty, support it. Now you see people that look like maybe your average Americans, but when you look a little closer and you look at this woman with the scarf over her head and the way this guy is dressed here and the kid here, and then you look in the background and you see, oh, there's a ship back there. This is propaganda intended for immigrants, right? If you immigrated to this country, abandon your prior country. You serve the United States. Support it. Step up and be a real American. Here again, you see the poster reaching out specifically to women. Wake up, America. You see the smoke and fire off in the distance. Civilization calls for every man, woman, and child to serve their country in its wartime efforts. And of course, this great piece of propaganda from the British Empire. When they were at peace, these places here all existed to make Britain fabulously wealthy. But hey, look at what happens when we're in times of war. We're all the same. Of course, Britain's the big dog, but New Zealand, South Africa, India, Canada, and Australia, you're just like us on all corners of the flag, patrolling to make sure the world is safe for the British Empire. So, why does the U.S. stay out of this fight first? As you guys know, the U.S. stayed neutral. The war began August 1st, 1914. We don't join until 2 years, 8 months, and 5 days later. Why? Well, you're looking at the first reason. This is a map of the German population in the United States, right around 1910. And this is all based from census data. We can call this information quite easily from census data, right? And you see all these different colors. Well, the red indicates counties in the U.S. where the German population was roughly 300 to 742 people out of 1,000. In other words, the German population was about 30 to 75%. The dark blue is where the German population was 20 to 30%. The lighter blue, the medium blue here, that's where the population was 10 to 20%. The light blue is 5 to 10% of the population was German, and the gray is just less than 5% was German. So one thing we can take away from this is we had a lot of people who were either recent immigrants from Germany or directly descended from German immigrants. We also, in this country, had a whole lot of people descended from British immigrants, considering that we were first a British colony, right? So the big question this map is asking is, if we join, what side do we join with? And perhaps an even bigger question is, what problems could taking sides cause us? Could literally tear our country apart. We also see another reason why we didn't join. This is the Monroe Doctrine in action. There's Uncle Sam standing on the Western Hemisphere, his hat tossed on South America. It says the Monroe Doctrine, and it's keeping the U.S. just, for the most part, separated from Europeans like John Bull, the mascot of England, and all the other European powers there. And you kind of see some subtle things going on in the background. You notice the sky behind Uncle Sam in the Western Hemisphere is clear and peaceful, while over in Europe it's cloudy, tumultuous, and stormy because of the war. So we're staying out of the war because of the Monroe Doctrine. It says we don't get involved in European affairs. You guys take care of your own problems. Another reason is Woodrow Wilson himself, the man who was initially training to be a minister, who left that to pursue a career in law instead. He wanted to be a minister like his father, who was a pretty prominent church leader at the time. Grew up with a very strong sense of pacifism and a belief that war was evil. And he said, and I quote here, "You lead this people, the American people, into war, and they will forget there was ever such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter the very fiber of national life. It's going to infect Congress, the courts, even the policeman out on the beat, the man in the street." And Wilson doesn't want to see that happen to the United States, the people in this country. But of course, what's ironic about this is he's making this statement the night before he delivered his war message to Congress. So he's saying this right at the same time he's getting ready to ask for a declaration of war. So why does the U.S. join with England once we join the fight? Well, the first reason is we had Germany practicing a rather controversial form of warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare. And here you see the north coast of France, the North Sea, and you see Ireland and the British Isles there. And all those hash marks around it is where the German Wolfpack, their submarine fleet, was patrolling for any ship that wasn't theirs. And as you guys know, they sunk any ship, often without warning. And early on in the war, we were trading with Germany, and we lost a lot of cargo ships to German submarines that were sinking them. but there wasn't a lot of sympathy. That wasn't getting a lot of attention. Lost cargo ships, they often didn't have very big crews, maybe only a dozen or two people. And these are people who are taking a risk by going into waters that they know are dangerous so they can make a profit. So it was hard to feel a whole lot of sympathy for them willingly going into a war zone. However, a year after the war had started in May of 1915, when the Lusitania was sunk, that starts to change people's opinions. When the ship was struck by two German torpedoes, the ship sunk really quick, and most of the people on board that ship died as a result. And it's kind of a tragic story. The Lusitania was the sister ship to the Titanic, which had sunk just 3 years earlier. So kind of a lot of disaster with that. You've got this great political cartoon of Germany not even noticing the significance of sinking the Lusitania with all the survivors trying to flee into the ocean. But there's a pissed off Uncle Sam across the Atlantic swearing vengeance. Germany should have been hip to this idea that doing that is just going to make us angry. But of course, Germany had their reasons for sinking the Lusitania along with other ships. We were arming England. And Germany didn't want that. We weren't behaving in a neutral way. In fact, in the hold of the Lusitania was a whole lot of munitions and war material that we were sending to England as well. Now, the truth of the matter is that we still wanted to trade with Germany. But if I go back to this picture really quick, we still wanted to trade with Germany. But England made that impossible by sowing underwater mines, and if you remember your Finding Nemo, you remember what those mines look like, at all of the river entrances that go in and flow into Germany. So it was impossible for our ships to get there and trade. Therefore, if we wanted to make money, there was only one side of the battle we could trade with, and that was France and England's side. So, what came out of the sinking of the Lusitania was powerful propaganda like this, with a very simple message to men: enlist. And if you don't look at this poster carefully, it may not make much sense to you. But if you look at the way this woman's hair is going and the way her clothes are flowing, she is clearly underwater and drowning. And in her arms is a baby who is dying with her. The message being very clear that the Germans are sinking and killing our women and children. Right? That's what happened on the Lusitania. Women and children died on that ship, not in those cargo ships that I mentioned earlier. And so people in the United States start getting a little uppity. And beginning in the middle of 1915, we're starting to hear Americans say, let's go fight Germany. Another thing that pulls us into the war, and perhaps the biggest reason we get involved in the war, is our economic ties to England. This chart right here shows you the amount of exports we were sending to Great Britain in the yellow, France in the green, Germany in the red, and all other European countries in blue. And it's kind of funky. England is our number one trade partner right up to the year the war starts in 1914. Germany is the number 2 country, even though you have all the other countries above them. Germany was the number 2 sole country, and France was number 3. But once we go to war, look at what happens to trade with Germany. It drops off the floor. Trade with France shoots way up. Trade with England shoots way up, as well as does trade with all of their allies. So we are making a lot of money in trade from these countries. That's part of the reason why we're going to join England and France's side. This chart explains another perspective. These are the loans that our banks gave. The UK in the light purple, France in the dark purple, Germany in the white, or pardon me, the kind of the fadish yellow, and then Austria in the bluish white. And again, you look at 1910 to 1914, the UK is getting most of our loans, anywhere from $500 million up to $600 billion a year. But the number 2 country that's getting the most loans from us is Germany. And that's increasing every year from just over $200 million in 1910 to it's doubling to nearly $400 million in 1914. Our banks were lending both countries a lot of money. And then the war is declared, and look at what happens to the loans. Our loans to England shoot way up to nearly $1 billion in 1 year, and our loans to France nearly triple, from less than $200 million to $400 million. And we are not lending money to Germany or Austria anymore. And what that basically means is if England and France loses the war, then they can't pay those loans off and we lose our cash. So one of the reasons we get into this war is to protect our banks and our businesses' interests. The Zimmerman Note, which came to light in January of 1917, was a very interesting blunder by the Germans. The Germans tried to entice the country of Mexico into this war by keeping us out of it. The Germans in this telegram promised that if Mexico would declare war on the U.S., would invade and fight a war with the U.S. and keep us bottled up so that we couldn't help England and France out, after Germany defeated England and France, they would come over and help Mexico reconquer all the territory they lost in the Mexican-American War. California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Utah, all that stuff. Well, Mexico, who was going through their own civil war at that very moment, said, we're in no way, shape, or form to do this. We are not going to mess with the United States. Forget you. England intercepted the telegram, showed it to us, and in January of 1917, huge outcry in America against Germany. More and more people begging for war. And what ultimately pushes us over is just a couple weeks before we join, Russia surrendered. And at this particular time in 1917, Russia went through tremendous internal turmoil. That was the year that they had the Communist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, in which Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks to oust the Tsar of Russia once and for all. And so there was a change in power, and one of the first things that Vladimir Lenin did when he got that power is he pulled the Russians out of the fight. Now, if you look at the map, you see Germany and Austria kind of wedged in between France and Russia. That meant those countries, they used to have to split their armies up to fight on both sides. With Russia out of the fight, Germany and Austria could concentrate all their armies on one direction alone. And Germany was doing a pretty good job. Even with their armies split, they were fighting both sides very, very well. They were wearing the French down. They were wearing the Russians down. It was kind of evident that they could beat both countries. When Russia quits, Germany now can send the full bear of their armies to France, and things are looking very desperate for the British and French. And so that's why we joined just a couple weeks later on April 6th of 1917. Now, let's take a look at how war changed here. I got some pictures for you. Let's look at the impact that industrialization has. You have new types of weapons, like these massive cannons the Germans called howitzers that could send shells that weighed several hundred pounds 10, 15, 20 miles off in the distance. These guys are killing enemies that they will never even see or hear or meet, right? And thanks to advanced mathematics, especially calculus and trigonometry, they're able to predict based on the layout of the land, the geography of the land, and which way the wind is blowing. They're able to predict how to fire with greater and greater accuracy. The airplane made its debut in this war. The airplane in 1914 was all of about 11, 12 years old since Orville and Wilbur Wright took it for a flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And already it's got uses. In the beginning of the war, it plays more of a reconnaissance role to allow both armies to kind of spy on each other. It also provides a means to shoot down the enemy's balloons, their spy balloons. And for good measure, sometimes when you are flying over an enemy's trench, you might have a bucket full of 10 penny nails. These are large nails that are about a foot in length that you just tilt out and dump over so they can go ahead and maybe spike a few of the bad guys there. Submarine warfare, as we have already talked about, played a very important role in this war, as submarines themselves are becoming larger and capable of inflicting more and more destruction from under the water. We see the debut of tanks that were invented solely to destroy trenches and trench warfare. They don't make their debut in the fight successfully until late 1917, and it's the British who first master the ability to produce motorized tanks. Trench warfare itself, you learned a lot about that in world history. It was kind of a war of attrition where two sides would just keep trying to charge and repel each other's attacks until one side ran out of men. Incredibly bloody affair, and if you've seen the movie 1917, that brought the realities of trench warfare to light as far as just how awful that fighting was. Especially in what was no man's land, which was the territory between enemy trenches. This used to be a forest. I believe this was the Ardennes forest in Germany that's reduced to nothing but sticks and rubble thanks to the artillery and machine gun fire. The Zeppelin, the blimp, made its debut in warfare at this point in time. The advantage to the blimps is they could carry a whole lot more weight, that is, more bombs to drop on the enemy. The downside is they moved very slow and were very big targets. So once we learned how to mount machine guns on airplanes and how to give the pilot the ability to shoot them, Their goal was nice and simple, just go and shoot down the Zeppelins. And in those days, Zeppelins were filled with hydrogen, which was flammable, so it didn't take much to destroy them. You get one lucky bullet that gives enough of a spark, and you blew up a whole balloon right there. This is also going to be the end of the Zeppelins in warfare. Flamethrowers and grenade launchers, personal grenade launchers, where the individual troop could be a form of small artillery himself with the power of his rifle and specially fitted grenades. The soldier could go ahead and fire off artillery at the enemy. And the flamethrowers, of course, were absolutely terrifying. If armies were charging into that wall of flame, you can imagine they didn't charge very far. And if you could get your flamethrowers over to the enemy's trench, you could turn their part of their trench into just an absolute apocalypse. World War I most infamously saw the use of poison gas, the deadly chemicals that industrial nations produce like phosgene and chlorine gas, as well as mustard gas, that all attack the soft tissue of the body. If you breathed in something like chlorine gas, it went to work immediately, dissolving the soft tissue inside your mouth, like your gums and your cheeks. And if it got into your esophagus, it started to dissolve your airway. If it got into your lungs, it dissolved your lungs. And so you're slowly choking to death on the dissolving pieces of your own respiratory system. And you're hacking it up, and it's just a miserable, gory, disgusting way to die. The machine gun, which had been around for a few years, made its all-star debut in World War I as the great leveler against big armies, as 2 or 3 guys working and keeping one machine gun loaded could be responsible for killing hundreds, if not thousands, of people charging at you from the other side. So we're not going to get into fighting World War I and what the U.S. was doing that, but what we do want to know is, what does it mean for the United States, and what does it do to the United States? Well, World War I creates something known as the lost generation. And if you haven't learned about the lost generation in your English classes, you'll probably do that your senior year. In the year and a half, roughly, that the United States fought in World War I, we see more than 4 million American men serve. And of those 4 million, 116,000 died. Huge casualty load for Americans. And what you're looking at in this picture is the aftermath of that. This is after World War I ended. And this gathering house, this warehouse, contains nothing but human remains, skeletal remains of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of bodies that littered the battlefield. Because when the war was on, it wasn't safe to go get them. And so if you ever happen to be in France and you see some of the cemeteries commemorating World War I, what you need to understand is, under those grave markers, there isn't anybody's specific body. They created a mass grave, interred all these remains of people, and then built the monuments and put the gravestones up afterwards. So when you're confronted with this aspect of war, this does something to your attitude about fighting war and going to fight and die for a flag. It kind of turns you sour to it, right? You had in the United States 200,000 men who were wounded or missing in action. And the wounded came back very, very scarred. Medical technology was slowly starting to improve as surgeries were becoming more and more antiseptic, thanks to the work of Joseph Lister, who kind of pioneered using antiseptic instruments to operate with. It's where we get Listerine from today. Some of these wounds were horrible. As you see, the man pictured on the left here had part of his nose and much of his jaw shot off. And you can imagine what it would be like for that guy to just try to walk around and lead a normal life. What you see on the right here is a prosthetic mask that he could wear over his face that, to the public, would make him seem all but whole and healthy, right? It was a way to hide his injuries. And out of World War I, there was born this whole industry of cosmetic appliances and even cosmetic surgeries to take these wounds and try to make these guys at least look a little more whole and human again. But the sad part about this is this war was so embittering for people around the world. People didn't want to see these guys because they reminded them of the shame of the horrors of World War I. And so there was a lot of countries turning their back on their veterans as a result. World War I exposed the powers of the Industrial Revolution, the powers of industrialized death to millions of people. More than 20 million people, or more than 20 million soldiers, are going to die in World War I, half of them Russians. And we've never had a war deliver those kind of casualties before, and it was just absolutely stunning. So what you got to understand about the title, of the Lost Generation is that it was a literal title. You had these men, some as young as 16, many as old as 45, 50, or even 60, who went off to go fight. 20 million of them didn't come back. That's like an entire generation that is gone forever. So the Lost Generation has a literal meaning, but it also has a symbolic meaning. And one of the things that members of the Lost Generation did is they turned their back on nationalism and militarism for good. The whole idea that you were born to serve your country, to fight and die for it in battle, was stamped out in World War I, a war in which only pot luck determined whether or not you lived. You know, if an artillery shell's coming in, does it hit your bunker or does it hit the next one? Because you can't dodge artillery. Do you get hit by machine gun fire, or does the guy who's running in front of you take that fire? Does your gas mask work or doesn't it? That's what was determining life and death, not how brave you were or how good a soldier you were. So these guys looked at celebrating the military and celebrating the flag and countries and their governments is just a disgusting thing. You don't do that. Those feelings died down after World War I. And you see some new philosophies as well as approaches to art kind of taking over after World War I in the form of existentialism, Dadaism, and surrealism. And existentialism was basically the philosophy that life is meaningless. You have this quote here, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. These people were atheistic. They didn't believe in God because if a God exists, how could God let something like World War I happen? And so therefore, meaning for your life doesn't lie in the hands of the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. It lies within your own self to define. And so they kind of embraced this whole notion of being a self-defined person. Dadaism and surrealism were two artistic responses to World War I because a lot of art had been employed in the Great War to recruit millions of people to go off and fight and die, right? And so these were in a lot of ways protests against that art that was used to encourage the lies that brought in millions to die in World War I. No form of art is more cynical and more sarcastic than Dada. As you see Marcel Duchamp, who's a French Dadaist artist, enter what you're looking at right here, and that is exactly what you think it is. It's a toilet. It's a urinal that he entered into an artistic competition under the name R. Mutt in 1917. And he's making a statement there. You want to know what art is? This is what art is. And what this item is for, that's what you should do with art. Art is a joke. Art is awful. Art should be ripped apart. Nobody should be taking art seriously. The surrealists, kind of led and pioneered by Salvador Dali, weren't quite as funny. They were still exploring artistic ideas, such as this famous painting by Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory. I believe he did this in 1929. The surrealists were a response to World War I as well, saying, you know what? Tune out the outside world. What's going on outside of you doesn't matter. It's what's inside that matters. And you see, beginning with the surrealist artists, kind of take on a more otherworldly characteristic in their art, trying to paint their dreams, trying to paint images or visions they have inside their head that may not mean anything literally, but for some reason they're important to them. And so you represent that. Right? Three big authors come out of the United States: Ernest Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and T.S. Eliot, who was, among other things, a poet. And they kind of represented the avant-garde U.S. writers at the time. And all three of these guys wrote with kind of a sarcastic, if not a sadly sarcastic tone towards things like war and glory and death, and embraced sort of that existentialist idea that life isn't very meaningful and you have to find it yourself. And so that's what their heroes are often trying to figure out to do, trying to figure out what is the meaning in all this we're experiencing, and what does it mean for me. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald being a novel that most of you will probably read before you graduate, and the emptiness that's kind of characterized. You see on the bottom half of the book the fair, the parties that were characterizing the 1920s. Even though alcohol was illegal, people still found a means to party, with this billboard image of the eyes and the mouth that the lead character couldn't get out of his head, and one of the bottle rockets that's going up looking almost like a tear, kind of symbolizing that Fitzgerald sees a lot of that stuff as just empty and meaningless and ultimately destructive, kind of making comments about the nature of man there. So you also see something else interesting. When Congress got us into the war, they immediately passed draft legislation, the Selective Service, that same month in April of 1917. And posters like this covered the walls of the United States of America. Attention, all males between the ages of 21 and 30 years, both inclusive. You must personally appear at the polling place in the election district in which you reside on Tuesday, June 5th, 1917 to register to vote. No excuse for failure, or pardon me, not register to vote, register for the draft. No excuse for failure to register will be accepted. And so the draft was instituted, just like it was instituted during the Civil War. And just like the Civil War, this draft came with controversies. First, we have 2 rounds of it. In 1917, we were drafting men from the ages of 21 to 30. And then in 1918, the draft expanded because we were running out of eligible 21-year-olds and 22 and 25 and 29 and 30-year-olds. The draft gets expanded to ages 18 and 45. And at this point in time, Germany was bringing up children as young as 12, 13, and 14, and men as old as their 60s to come out and fight. And that's kind of emblematic of the fact that these countries, they're running out of men to fight. They're just being killed off, right? So the draft is controversial for a number of reasons. First of all, this is the first draft we've had since the 13th Amendment was passed. And if you remember the 13th Amendment, it ended slavery. In other words, it ended the right of the government or anybody else to force somebody to work against your will. Well, if you get drafted, you're essentially working against your will. So there was controversy with that. You also had issues with the First Amendment because you had a nation full of Christians. Nearly 90% of the United States was Christian, and there are these things called the 10 Commandments. And one of the very most important of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not kill, but what do you do in war? Well, if you embrace your faith and you embrace those commandments as God's instructions to you, how can you go fight in a war and potentially kill somebody yet still be a good Christian and follow your own religious beliefs? And then there's the other issue of just the quality of the troops, and something the U.S. learns war after war after war, all the way up to Vietnam, that when you have to draft, when you have to force people to come out and fight for you, they tend to not be the best soldiers you can get. And so some big controversies come down for that. Now, the Supreme Court, interestingly enough, says, yes, the 13th Amendment doesn't apply. When we're at war, the president has more powers than when we aren't, and that means the president can violate some of your rights, including the 13th Amendment. If we need you to fight in the war, the president can call you up. Regarding religious issues, the government gave some people, like Quakers, who had always been pacifists and refused to pick up a gun and fight ever since the Revolutionary War, the government gave them exemptions. If you could prove that you have been following your religion very, very closely, then you could be exempt from the draft, or at the very least, you could be drafted into service that's non-combative, meaning you won't be fighting the enemy hand to hand. Now, let's talk about how the war was also an issue of defending freedom as well. In 1917, Congress passed 2 very controversial laws, the Sedition and Espionage Acts. And these were designed to protect our war efforts, specifically against people who would speak out against the country, people who encouraged rebellion or treason against the country, and people who would sabotage our war effort, maybe blow up factories or train tracks to fight it. Well, what this law basically meant is that if you publicly or through the mail made any statement whatsoever against the U.S. government and its war effort, you would get fined $10,000 and do 10 years in jail for every instance of that. Now, clearly, there's an issue with the First Amendment there. This law is stepping all over First Amendment's rights, and it was insanely unpopular. It goes back to the Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams passed in 1797, 120 years earlier, to curb all the pressure in the country to get involved in the war between Napoleon and Britain at the time. Here you see a political cartoon with this giant serpent depicting the Espionage and Sedition Acts coming after these 3 little kids named Honest Opinion, Free Speech, and a Free Press, saying that this giant evil bill is going to eat up, our most precious First Amendment rights. And then you have Eugene Debs, who did not win the election in 1912, but was not cowed by this law. He went around the country making several speeches, as you see him here doing, why the United States should not get involved in this war, and actively encouraging men to not sign up for it. He was calling it a rich man's war, but a poor man's fights. He condemned this war as a war for the interests of banks and big business, and encouraged men not to sign up to volunteer to lose your life just so banks can hang on to their profits. Well, on June 16th of 1918, he was arrested for making just such a speech against the draft in our war efforts in Europe. and he was charged on 10 counts and imprisoned and fined. He was going to have to spend his life in prison, and he was also going to have to pay up $100,000, which was way more money than he or most Americans ever had at that time. So you see this picture of him behind bars. And Eugene Victor Debs decides to do what he'd been doing in the last few elections. He runs for president behind bars anyway. And here you see him, for president, convict number 9653. And in 1920, he captured from behind bars in jail somewhere near 500,000 votes anyway. Don't worry, though, if you're a fan of Eugene Debs, his life isn't going to end in prison. In 1921, when the recently elected Republican President Harding comes into office, he pardons Debs for speaking out against an unpopular war anyway and lets him out of jail. So Debs only does about 3 years in the big house. So that was one of the big arguments that Wilson had put out. We are fighting this war to protect democracy around the world. But were we? Were we? One of the things that notes is that even though they didn't have the vote, 1 million brand new women to the workforce come out and join the workforce by 1918. That's in addition to the millions of women who are already working. And most of these women came out and worked in munitions plants. Right? They came out stuffing mortar shells like you see here. And this was very, very dangerous work. As not only is the gunpowder and the chemicals they're packing into those shells, it's very toxic and it can get absorbed through the skin. You had a lot of women get very sick and even die from exposure to it. But, like I said kind of jokingly earlier on, if this woman accidentally fumbles this shell and drops it on the ground, you imagine what happens to the whole factory full of those shells. Big, big booms. And here again, you see women kind of putting the finishing touches on shells of different sizes that they were making during World War I. But also of note is that women were picking up the plow literally at home. Here you see a picture of women in the South literally plowing the land themselves, pulling it themselves. Well, why don't they have horses? Because some 3 million horses in America were called up to serve in the war effort. This was at a time where we were kind of transitioning. There were some cars, there were some trucks, there were even motorcycles, but we weren't mass producing them. So horse-drawn carriages, horse-drawn carts were a very common way you saw in World War I of supplying the front lines with everything from food to weapons and carrying back the injured or the dead that could be saved, right? Saved from rotting in no man's land. And so that meant your family horse, who was, for all intents and purposes, maybe the plow on your farm is gone. And so women on farms pulled together, literally, and pulled the plow to keep America growing food. And what is significant about that fact is that unlike World War II, where we rationed food, the government dictated how much of most kinds of food you could have on a weekly basis, the U.S. never had to do that during World War I. Such was the ability of us to grow food during that war that we didn't need to ration it, right? And you have those progressive women, those suffragettes we mentioned so long ago in this presentation, who are so very angry at the U.S. for getting into World War I in the first place. Their arguments being, of course, Mr. President, if we're fighting for democracy abroad, why don't we have it here? How long do American women have to wait for the same liberty you're trying to fight and secure overseas for? And this particular woman was protesting. That's right outside the White House. That's the front gates of the White House. And every day we're in war, suffragettes would hang different posters criticizing the U.S. and would stand proudly by them, sometimes getting a lot of very negative reactions from passers-by, being called traitors or being hit with snowballs in the winter or even being physically attacked. For those of you who remember Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, those two women were two of the women who were doing this. They were right there in front of the White House picketing and protesting. And in large part because of the success that suffragettes had in campaigning for not for World War I, but the right to vote, as well as the fact that America could not have produced like it did in that war without women's help. Immediately after the war is over, in 1919, the 19th Amendments are ratified, and it goes into effect January of 1920. Another interesting impact of World War I was on movement inside the country, peopling, migration, specifically for African Americans. as World War I opened up a lot of factory jobs, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast in towns like Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, East Coast cities like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York City, Boston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Delaware, the state of Delaware, right? You see hundreds of thousands of African Americans flee the South, getting out however they can, taking the rails up, hitchhiking, in some cases even walking for those new opportunities to get jobs. And between 1910 and 1920, nearly 500,000 African Americans left the Jim Crow South for opportunities that were opening up in the Northeast. It's not going to be the first time it's going to pull a lot of blacks out of the South, but it's the first prominent time since Reconstruction. Many blacks are leaving at that time. Here you see a picture of a family who did just that, a black family who left from the rural South, arriving in Chicago with everything they own, their best clothes, looking to start a new life in the big city. Chicago was kind of interesting. So many African Americans migrated up to Chicago that the vote changed dramatically, and you have, as a result, many of the first blacks elected to positions of city leadership elected in the city of Chicago for the first time because of the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of blacks also came out and fought, in no small part thanks to propaganda like this, drawing not racial exaggerated stereotypes, but proud, strong-looking African-American men kicking German butt and waving the American flag proud while Abraham Lincoln is watching them with pride from heaven, right? African Americans were encouraged to join this fight. They were needed. We knew that the war in Europe was nothing but a meat grinder. We needed as many bodies as we could get. However, the experience for those blacks, and here you see a huge warehouse full. These are African Americans being entertained the night before they're put on ships running over the Atlantic to France to go fight. The work they experienced, however, was not what they were told when they were recruited. You see here, these men are gathering up pieces of bodies from different parts of the battlefield where they could safely do that. African Americans were largely put to work cleaning up after battles. They were put in charge of cooking and digging outhouses, latrines for white soldiers. They were not given much of a chance to fight side by side with white troops, and that's because most white troops and their leaders didn't want to fight with them. There weren't very many black officers because white officers would not salute or follow orders from a black man. And so you had Jim Crow really kind of solidify in the Army as a result. The Army was completely segregated itself. Black troops serving in one part, white troops serving in another. But what's interesting from the black experience is that France recognized those black troops who fought with heroism and decorated them even when the United States wouldn't. So here you're seeing American troops, black American troops, getting decorated with medals from French leaders. And many African Americans were shocked at the state of race relations in France. They would see black mixed race couples holding hands, kissing openly, universities and art schools alike, black students and white students sitting side by side, black managers of restaurants with white employees. And they saw in Paris almost a paradise. And so many African American troops after the war was over chose to stay in France as their attitudes towards race were a lot more relaxed than they were in the US. And so they kind of turned their back on their country and expatriated themselves. As far as for those black troops who did come back home, the welcome you got depended on where you were. This was in Harlem, New York, where black veterans and wounded black veterans such as this man right here received throngs of African American supporters clapping and cheering them on. However, if you were a black soldier coming home to the South, you did not wear your uniform out in public because that was seen by especially the poor white racist South as you trying to say that you're better than everyone else. Wearing your uniform would get you jumped, probably even lynched in the South. And that had happened all the way even through World War II. So kind of a complex interaction with World War I for our African American population. Now, the treaty that comes out of World War I is really, really important, right? It had some big stipulations. Woodrow Wilson had hoped that the final treaty was going to end war around the world. This is going to be the end of fighting. We're going to create a lasting peace for eternity. What actually comes out of Versailles, because the British, the French, and the Belgians had no particular interest in listening to a lot of what the American idealist was spouting, especially when he wasn't fighting in that war as long as they were. was a little bit different. So here's what the final treaty looked like. Chapter 231, or Article 231 of it's the most infamous part of it. 231 laid the blame for World War I squarely on the feet of the Germans. It said the Germans caused World War I. It is their fault entirely. Sort of a humiliating prospect. Other chapters, other articles in the treaty took away Germany's ability to defend itself. It limited Germany to an army of only 100,000 people, which at that point in history was nothing. That wasn't even an army. They couldn't have an air force. They couldn't have a battleship fleet. They couldn't have a submarine fleet. And so they kind of stripped Germany of its ability to defend itself. They demilitarized it, so made it feel very naked and alone. They also financially ruined Germany. The Allies said, well, since the war was your fault, you got to pay the cost for it, and that means you got to write us a blank check when we won it, and that total came out to about $33 billion back then, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of half to $750 billion today. Now, there's a problem with asking the country you just beat in war to give you $33 billion, because you don't quit fighting a war when you've got billions and billions left in the bank. You quit when you've got nothing left. So these countries are basically asking Germany, who has nothing, to pay them $33 billion out of nothing. And for those of you who remember your world history, remember that Germany, out of desperation to keep England and France from enforcing the Versailles Treaty and taking over parts of Germany's territory, they just went to the printing presses and they printed off hundreds of trillions of Deutschmarks. That was their currency back then. And that had the sad effect of completely devaluing, demonetizing their currency. It turned their currency into nothing. And so the years economically for Germany from 1921 to 1923 were utterly desolate. And so you have all three of those factors there. Germany's been shamed, Germany's been left defenseless, and Germany is economically broke, sewed into the Versailles Treaty. And it's no accident you see what crawling out of it but the Hitler Party, the Nazi Party, crawling out of the Versailles Treaty, because all this is going to do is it's going to make Germany angry and want revenge. And that's why we have World War II, because that's exactly what Hitler felt, that Germany got totally worked over and unfairly blamed and unfairly hit for this. So you see one action causing another. The thing that Wilson did want in the treaty, though, was the League of Nations. The Versailles Treaty created the League of Nations. Unfortunately, though, it was very, very weak. The League of Nations had a couple interesting postulates in it. One of it said that the League can't take action unless every country votes in favor of taking that action. In other words, they have to get a unanimous vote. Now, the problem with that is, let's say you have two members of the League of Nations who are fighting with each other. Like maybe China or maybe Japan is trying to invade China, both members of the League of Nations. Well, if you have to have a unanimous vote to get Japan out of there, you're not going to get it because Japan won't vote against itself. And so the League of Nations kind of got depicted in the press as a very weak organization, in this case a bunny rabbit, that's going to be at the beck and call, that's going to be the victim of the volume of international strife and conflict. It's not going to be able to defend itself. So a lot of people knew when the League of Nations was created that it would not be able to effectively work. It was just set up as too weak because no country wanted to give up too much of their own power to an international organization that could tell them what to do. All right? But Wilson seemed very, very tickled with it. This was his baby. He created it. He believed that if nations cooperated and worked together and talked together more out in the open, it would reduce the likelihood of war. And so he believed in it. Now, here you've got him trying to enact a little piece out of the Bible with the dove carrying the olive branch, except here you see the size of the dove, and the olive branch with the League of Nations on it may be just a little too big for that bird to carry. Wilson got behind the League of Nations, got behind the Versailles Treaty because it had the League of Nations in it. But he didn't realize how much the attitude in America had changed when he came back from working on the Versailles Treaty while he was in Europe. And so as a result, you see, like I mentioned earlier, hyperinflation in Germany. And that kind of created an interesting cycle of debt, right? The U.S. bailed Germany out of its hyperinflation. We gave Germany a great big $5 billion loan that they could go ahead and use to stabilize their economy and make more money from taxes so they could pay their debt to France and England. France takes that money that Germany just paid them and uses that to pay our debts back. England and France use that money they collect from Germany to pay the debts they have to us back. But the problem is is the money isn't really getting repaid. It's like it's just going around in a big circle. And this ends up creating even more debt within and between countries as well. Debt that's going to help explain why we get into the Great Depression. And it was the Dawes Plan, like I mentioned, that was set to bail it out. And at the end of the Versailles Treaty, we are poised with this question. The League of Nations is basically asking, do we want to abandon, after 100 years, the use of the Monroe Doctrine and being an isolated country? Or now that we're one of the most powerful, definitely the wealthiest country on earth, do we want to take our seat in global leadership with all the other countries? Yes or no? And this cartoon is symbolizing exactly what's going to happen. Here you have the minister not reading from the Bible, but the League of Nations marrying the bride and groom. And who are they? Well, you can make out Uncle Sam's goatee and his hair there, his jacket with the long tails, and you see his striped pants. The bride symbolizes foreign entanglements. The United States is getting married to international problems. And the minister is saying those faithful words, if any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak. And breaking through the window is the United States Senate, who in 1918 and 1920, because of how unpopular the war was in the U.S., made big gains. The Republicans were selling themselves as, hey, we wanted to stay out of this war. Wilson got us into it, so vote for us if you don't like the war. And the Republicans made huge gains in the Senate. Now, why is the Senate so important? Because the president gets to write treaties. The Senate gets to approve them and decide whether or not they become part of United States law. And here's the U.S. Senate breaking through the window, holding on to the U.S. Constitution, saying, no way are we going to accept this treaty. We are not going to join the League of Nations. We are not going to be a part of foreign entanglements around the world. And here we look at the political future for the Democrats. How much did World War I hurt their popularity? Well, in this particular case, the green are the Republicans, the yellow are the Democrats. And we see the voting go right back to what it was so many years ago in 1920, with the Republicans dominating the Northeast and throughout the West, and the Democrats really only holding on to the southern states, because the Democrats at this point are still pitching Jim Crow and segregation, and that's the only place where it's going to be. Debs, who ran for president, pardon me, I said earlier he got 500,000 votes. He got nearly 1 million votes this time around. 3.4% of the U.S. population cast a vote for him, and remember, he was running from jail at that time. So that ends our presentation. That was a long one, I know, but man, we had so much stuff to catch up on. I'm going to upload the slideshow to our classroom so you can access that if you want. If you have questions, hit me up in our Zoom chats or email me. Thank you very much.